God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. I'm delighted to have Dena Grace with me, who used to be Dena Andrews, which was kind of easier, Dena, to say.
Yes.
And I put in your little name thing, Dena Grace, because you have a blog site, denagrace.com, which is wonderful. Yes. We'll chat a bit about that. So, Dena, where are you right now?
I am sitting in a suburb above Seattle, Washington.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, over the years at the Institute, we've generally had people show up on our doorstep and say, I'm going to come and work for you for 6 months or a year, and sometimes 3 months, and they stay 6 years. You know how those things go. And you were one of the people where actually we approached you. But before we get there, let's back up a little bit. You're up in Seattle. We met you in Tahoe, actually. You used to be one of the organizers of this, I don't want to call it a singles retreat, but it was really a singles retreat. Hundreds of young people from, well, young professionals, I should say, from the West Coast primarily.
Primarily, yes. It was called Generation Next, and It was sponsored by a senator out of the Tahoe region.
Okay.
And we had some people from the East Coast, but it was primarily West Coast bias.
That's right, yeah. And then I got to speak there once or twice about relationships and marriage and things like that, and have lots of fun conversations. And so we sat next to you at one of the meetings, and it wasn't long after that you were helping organize a repurposing business training up in the Seattle area. And I remember one day you sent me an email and said, I asked you why you weren't going to Johannesburg on the venture that was coming up, our short-term missions trip. You said, look, I'm 6 months into a new job. I'm running this thing. We're setting up a new medical facility and so forth. I can't go. And then you remember what happened next.
I got fired.
It was awesome. I sent Dena an email saying, I'm sorry, not really. Get a plane ticket for Johannesburg, which was great because you got to go with your team on a venture to Johannesburg. Was that 2016 or when was that?
That was 2006.
Yeah.
Yes, September 2006. And my passport was expired. I had no money. I had no ticket. And it was 10 days before the venture.
Yeah.
And God got all of it done. In less than 10 days.
Yeah. In fact, I recall you rushing to the airport so quickly that you didn't have time to eat, really. And there you were at 37,000 feet, and the cart came past with the nuts and the drinks. Then what happened? And tell us what happened then.
Well, actually, we were. It was my flight. I flew from Seattle to wherever, and then I got it was
Amsterdam, right?
Super tight.
Yeah.
And I didn't have time to get any food. Now I had like the power bar things in my briefcase, but they were locked in the overhead container, and it was a really rough flight. And so we couldn't get up to get them. And I was so hungry. But the lady came through with a basket, and she was passing out nuts. And I had anaphylactic reaction to cashews, almonds, walnuts when I was 12. So I had completely avoided them and didn't want to have that again. And if you've ever had allergy testing, my whole forearm was like, they did the cashew here, and my whole forearm was like they're like, just stay away from them.
Yeah.
And so I had, and then this lady comes through, and I'm so hungry. And I just took one and I held it in my hand, and God's like, you can eat it. And I'm like, it's got cashews in it. And he's like, and you can eat it.
Yeah.
And so I trusted the little voice in my head at 20,000+ feet, and I ate cashews and almonds and had no problem. Never had since.
Yeah. Now, was there somebody else that you'd seen get healed of allergies before that?
Yes. I think her name was Katie and she ate fish. You'll have
Yes.
to tell that story. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
what I was
yeah.
banking on.
Yeah, so Katie McInerney had gone with us. She worked at eBay at the time. She was a manager there. Gone to Indonesia on a venture with us. And part of what we do is we divide up the clients and the consultants. We allocate them primarily. We pray and we decide A should go with company B and so forth. And Katie was there. She got allocated to a client who was a fish wholesaler and retailer. And the second day of the consultation was actually Katie's birthday. So the Indonesians, being generous as they are, brought out 7 different types of fish for her to eat for her birthday. But the problem was she was allergic to fish. She remembered during the training, however, that we taught people you have to eat what's put in front of you. So she prayed and God completely protected her and healed her of her fish allergy, which she hadn't expected. I mean, this was a completely new thing, but she was just doing what she thought was the right thing. And so I know when you were contemplating eating the nuts that you had remembered Katie's story. And it's powerful, that
Yes.
power of
Yes.
the testimony. And in fact, later on, Kim Wilson worked with us for many years. And Kim had any number of allergies. I think she was on 4 medications a day or a number of medications a day. And God healed her of her allergies as well. So now we had Katie and Dena and Kim. And then on our first executive intensive, first or second in Saratoga, we had a couple who were there, and it was interesting because the wife had said to us, look, my husband will come along. We said, have him just come to the dinner on the Sunday evening and then we'll see how it goes. And Fritz had decided to stay. And on the Wednesday, we looked across and his eyes were streaming, his nose was running, and he had some sort of allergy attack. And so I remember Lynn saying to you and to Kim, hey, you guys have been healed of allergies, and you prayed for Fritz, and he was healed right away. Immediately. And that actually led to him, I believe, part of the story of him coming into a personal relationship with Jesus 3 or 4 days later, which is wonderful. So, a good return on investment on eating those nuts. And are you still eating nuts?
Yep. Got them down in the pantry right now.
Fantastic.
I didn't know I was missing out on pistachios. I love them. They're my favorite.
Yeah, quite something. Now, then you went on many ventures, of course, and then we asked you to join our staff, and you headed up our intercession and our prayer network. And so over the years, you saw some amazing miracles. And one of the miracles comes when we match consultants and clients. And you ended up actually consulting to Darlene in the Johannesburg area. Tell us that story.
So I had traveled with you the previous fall, and I felt that God said, you need to go back. And I was okay. So I was one of the very first people to sign up for the team, and I was super excited to go. But we didn't have a team leader. We had nothing yet. So I think the venture was like in May, and I signed up in February. I was super excited. Well, we get there, and Darlene hadn't signed up yet. She called the night before the venture. And so we had prayed through you guys had prayed through and placed people. And then that night she calls, she joins in. And so I got slipped over in the last minute, and I was like, okay, God must have a reason. So the next morning I meet this very perky, happy, lovely blonde lady who has got enough joy to power a nation. I mean, she's just such a lovely lady, and she ran a hospitality business. Yeah. But I was noticing that certain things about her, she was having a hard time remembering names, and she covered really well. But I'm like, things just aren't matching up for me. And I was a physical therapist by trade. That's what I went to school for. And I'm like, things just aren't adding up for me. So I asked her the next morning, asked her a few key questions. And I was like, oh, okay, I think I know what's going on. And by lunch, I was like, have you ever hit your head? And she's like, oh yeah, I fell down a flight of stairs. I'm like, oh my gosh, this woman had a severe traumatic brain injury. Okay. She covers for it amazingly well. She's a physical therapist and speech therapist dream. I mean, she does every compensation method possible, and she's successful.
Yeah.
But I was like, learning for her is difficult.
Mhm.
So I was able to structure the whole thing for her. And because I knew how to do it, because I had specially trained to do that.
Right.
So God sent me from Seattle, Washington to South Africa
Yeah.
to work with this lady who had a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
And it was amazing because we basically took everything. She had a hard time reading. Letters would swim. So we took everything and made it into a picture for her. And she was able to do it all. It was, wow. It was just, she felt so loved and seen by God that he would, tell me in February that I needed to be there. And when she signed up the night before, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and Dina, you'll remember, fast forward some years when we went off to Neisner, and Joe Gonzalez had a client. And Joe, if you think about the client matching again, Joe had asked God for some specific words for the client that he was going to have. And you might remember that story where he was partnered with a man. It was a most unusual client. I mean, he was a very interesting guy. And he was doing a financing type of business, but he'd been through some stuff in his life, some personal loss and some other things. And as he unpacked his story, then Joe gave him the pre-written things that God had pre-written, predated, that only God would have known. And it caused such a connection between the two of them that it was just amazing. And of course, speaking of miracles, that same man, he had diabetes, consequently didn't have feeling in his feet. And you'll remember that Joe and Denise and Lynn prayed for him, and God gave the feeling back in his feet and completely restored that. And he left the venture a day early, went home to tell his wife, to show his wife. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Yeah, so that matching is quite something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, on the personal side, I'd like to pick up two stories. I remember we were staying in Saratoga, and you were heading towards your 40th birthday, and you were starting to get worried about your eyesight, and you were saying, God, I'm too young to get bifocals. And because you were having trouble just adjusting when you looked far and close, it took a few seconds, it just wasn't normal for you. What was going on with your eyesight? What had happened? What was the actual issue there?
So when I was 19, I was diagnosed with an astigmatism and nearsightedness. And from that point on, I either wore glasses, single vision glasses, or contacts. And I had been hearing about people having their eyesight healed. And I was like, I want that. And so I was like, God, I want my eyes healed. I want my eyes healed. And I was pushing in for it. And somehow I ended up at a meeting in the South Bay of California. And this one guy was talking about, a man made a comment, hey, where are your glasses? He goes, oh, God healed my eyes. I don't need them anymore. I'm like, oh, you need to pray for me. I want that. So this man, I didn't even know, I still don't know his name. He was in his 60s, not really super nice guy. He prayed for me, real short prayer, and nothing happened. I went home the next day. I woke up expecting to open my eyes and everything. Nothing happened. Yeah. And it was about 2 weeks later. I remember you and Lynn were prepping to go to Lagos the next day. Yeah. And I was sitting at your kitchen table, and I looked up, and the French doors to the kitchen opened, and I was blinking. I couldn't see who it was. I was blinking. With my contacts in, I couldn't see. Yeah. And so finally it cleared, and I'm like, something's really wrong. So I took you guys to the airport the next day, and I went straight to Costco's eye center. Yeah. And they tested my eyes, and she's like, have you had LASIK surgery? And I'm like, no. She's like, well, it's like you've had LASIK. She goes, your eyes aren't absolutely perfect, but they're really close. She goes, you don't need to wear any corrective lenses at all. She goes, if you want to read glasses for reading glasses, that's great, or computer glasses, but you don't need any corrective lenses. And I'm like, I had Holy Spirit LASIK? The lady looks at me like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And my eyes were completely fine.
Yeah. Amazing story, because you hear somebody else, and then the principle, if they've had a breakthrough in an area, and this applies in the business world, so often we'll do it. Somebody needs a property deal, well, have that person pray for you. Somebody needs a revenue increase, a loan forgiven, equipment healed, fixed, equipment fixed. They can do that. So it's a fascinating thing. And so So it didn't end there. So the guy at church, his name you don't know, then your eyes get healed. Then what happened with Kara?
So we went out to Santa Cruz to see something. And I was with a group. We were all in a group of people in the car, and she was sitting in the middle back so she could see straight out the front window. And I had shared how my eyes were completely fine. She goes, I want that. And so we prayed for her in the car, and she took off her glasses, and nothing changed. She put them back on, and she couldn't see out of them. She took them off, and she could see the road signs clear as a bell.
Yeah.
Just boom. It was crazy. It was so much fun.
Yeah.
So much fun.
Yeah, wonderful. It's almost like collateral healing in some respects. I remember when Rich So went off to Awanda Chiropractic, and he had some issues with tinnitus, and he'd been to Stanford Medical Clinic, and they told him he had to get a cranial sacral adjustment, something like it, it's some chiropractic term. And he called up Awanda Chiropractic, and they said, you can come in 2 weeks. And he said, the front desk said that. And he said, look, I really, have a problem. I need to come in today. He went in. And then he said, look, would you guys pray that the ringing in my ear would go down, because it's at a 7 or an 8. And if it could just go down, then I could sleep at night. And Donna Awanda said, no, we won't pray that. We'll pray that it'll go away completely, because last night I had a dream. And in the dream, I saw a piece of paper just sort of flying through the air, and on it was written cranial sacral adjustment. So I knew somebody was coming in who needs healing. And they gave him the adjustment, but they prayed for him, and got healed within about a week completely. His tinnitus was gone. But he also had sliced off the end of his finger with a Cutco knife, and he didn't have the feeling. They'd sewn it back on, didn't have the feeling in his finger. Nobody had prayed for that, and that was also healed. So it's almost what I call a collateral healing when that happens. Yeah. And then in your family, tell us a bit about your sister, Michelle. That was just quite an amazing story.
My sister is an RN, and I'm not exactly sure how her heart got affected, but she was, her heart got damaged. And I'm not sure how it happened. I think it was through something at the hospital, but I don't know all the backstory. But she had come down to the Bay Area to visit me, and she asked if we could go by Stanford Hospital. And I'm like, why? She goes, well, because that's one of the places where heart transplants are done.
Right.
It was either the UW or Stanford is where I would fly. And I'm like, I didn't realize it was that serious, because she keeps things very close to the chest.
Right.
And so I was like, well, God can fix that for you. And she goes, I know, when I go to heaven, God will give me a new heart. And I'm like, no, he can do it now.
Yeah.
And she wasn't there yet. Now my sister's totally on board with this stuff, but she wasn't then. And she was kind of like, okay. Well, that night we went back to my apartment above the garage, and I was prepping for something at church the next day. And she came in, she goes, tell me more about this, God can give me a new heart thing. And so, I kind of explained how God can heal today, and he does heal today, and that he wants to heal today. And I was kind of distracted with what I was doing. So I said a very simple prayer, and she went off to bed. And my sister was always cold. It would be 80 degrees outside, and she's cold because her heart is working so hard. And going up a flight of stairs, she would wheeze with the strenuousness of it. And her lips were blue.
Yeah.
And the next morning I walk out, and she had been on my little day bed in my living room, and she slept with a stocking cap on and gloves and socks, and the socks were flung across the room. The stocking hat was hanging from the lamp, and she goes, why did you turn the heat up so high last night? And I'm like, I didn't touch it. I didn't touch it. She goes, it's so hot in here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, long story short, she went to her cardiologist. They said, your heart's completely healed. There's nothing wrong with it. Right. There's nothing wrong with it. She flushed all of her cardiac meds, everything. It was completely restored. After that, she runs, she bicycles, she lives on the second story of her apartment building. Mm-hmm. No problem whatsoever after that. Yeah. Completely restored.
There was a bit of interaction there, because you prayed and she was sitting on the bed. You were doing your preparation to talk at church. and then she felt a few sensations. She kind of felt something in her chest. And you said to her, well, ask Jesus what he's doing. And then she said, well, he says he's giving me a new heart. And so there was a bit of an interaction back and forth over there. And just a fabulous thing. And just the tenderness of God to do that, and to do that for her, and to turn what seemed to be an inevitable bad thing into something that was just quite miraculous. Now, it's one thing to see that with family members and among people who are believers, but we know that statistically, Jesus did most of his miracles in the marketplace. I think in his book, Anointed for Business, Ed Silvosa says there's 139 extraordinary miracles, of which 119 happened in the marketplace. Certainly in the book of Acts, there's about 40 major miracles, and one happened in the temple. The rest happened out there. And so we actually expect God to do more with people who are pre-believers, who don't know Jesus yet. And that's the fun part, because that's how God advertises. He advertises through signs and wonders and miraculous interventions in a business context that business people can't explain away. And often we've seen business people say, wow, God must be interested in me because he did this miracle in my business. If God does a miracle, their kid gets better, or, they get a bit of money or something, they tend to think, okay, well, that's God's job to take care of stuff on the home front. But in the business, it's super validating for business people when God intervenes. And so I know, Dena, we did many, many trips together. And one of those trips was to Jakarta in Indonesia. And we had a team out there, and then we stayed on to do some lemon leadership work and working around the purpose of a company that was at that time the fastest growing direct sales company in the world. They'd gone from 0 to 250,000 distributors in 3 years. And it was an amazing growth pattern. The CEO was clearly a believer. Many of his staff were not. It's predominantly a Muslim country. And the head of product development was a wonderful guy, Dr. Dripa, who had a blog, had a website. He was an ardent Muslim student. And we had some good interactions. I remember one of them was around the purpose of the business. And we talked about the purpose of the business being to bless their people, to transform or empower their people, transform the industry, which was a direct sales business, and then to bless the nations. And Dr. Dripa, you'll remember, said, excuse me, I don't think we can bless nations. I think only God can bless nations, which is a fair comment. And so I explained to him, I took him back to Genesis, God's conversation with Abraham. I will bless you and you will be a blessing to all nations. And when I shared that scripture, Dr. Dripa said, okay. That was fun. But you had an interaction with Dr. Dripa. Tell us about that.
Well, Dr. Dripa, very charismatic individual. And, if he's in the room, everybody knows it, because he's just a lovely, effusive person. And women in Indonesia, especially white women, aren't allowed to address them directly, especially one-on-one. And so I was the undercover intercessor / secretary / office assistant, and I was in my hotel room praying for the next day. And God said, I want you to write these verses down. I'm like, okay. So I got out a little 3x5 card. I couldn't tell you what I wrote down. I wrote them down. And several years before that, God had given me the picture of a breast cancer ribbon. And I'm like, and he's like, find out what colors mean. Okay. So I found out what all the colors mean. So he goes, now I want you to get ribbons, cut them, and then I'm going to tell you what to give what people. I'm like, okay. So
like the little ones that go on the lapel.
Yeah. Little lapel ribbons. And so my ribbon ministry started. And so he told me what colors to get and why. And I was like, okay. He goes, and that's for Dr. Dripa. And I was like,
for example, a white ribbon might be purity, or a purple one royalty, or a green one something else. Or so you had a code in your mind.
Yeah. So I was like, okay. And so I said, okay, Lord, I'm happy to give this to him. You just need to make the time and the place, because I have no idea how a white woman is going to approach an Indonesian Muslim male. So you're going to have to make that happen.
And we had about 125 people in the meeting. So it wasn't just a few people in the meeting.
Right. And I didn't want to do it in front of everyone because I was like, okay. So long story short, there was a call center and I was walking one way, he was walking the other way. And I hear in my head, now's the time. Yeah. So I had it in my suit jacket. So I pulled it out and I handed it to him with two hands. And I said, Dr. Dripa, God was talking to me about you last night. And I feel he said these things. And he nods his head. Okay, thank you. And he goes on his way. Well, he went off to, I can't remember what Sugiri was the head of, but Sugiri was a very hardcore Jesus believing individual. And he comes bouncing like Tigger into the conference room. And it was just you, me, and Errol in there. And he is bouncing all over the place. And you're like, Sugiri, what's going on? What's going on? And Sugiri's like, Dripa just came into my office, slapped the 3x5 card down and said, explain this to me.
Yeah.
And he goes, I have been praying those two verses over my boss since I started working for this company. And he goes, through those two verses, I was able to explain the gospel to him, who Jesus really is, and kind of set the whole thing up. Yeah. And he's like, I've been asking God for an opportunity for years. He goes, why did you give him those two verses? And I said, because that's what God told me to do.
Yeah, wonderful.
And then I had the CEO, the COO, the CFO all come up to me and ask me for ribbons. They wanted their own. And then they wore them on their lapel around the business for the rest of the time we were there. It was just so amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing. Yeah. And as we've gone in, whenever we're doing a consultation with companies, we will normally have 10 companies and we'll have a team of consultants, but we also have a team of intercessors. And it's been interesting, Dena. I remember other situations in Indonesia, and it's not always pleasant, the things that the intercessors come up with, like you've been cheating on your taxes, or you've got a problem in your marriage, or
you have double books.
Yeah, two sets of books, or there's something going on, there's dynamics in the family. But still, it's something that opens up people's hearts. I remember the one situation in Indonesia. I think Rebecca might have been leading that team, and you were there, and there was a couple, and you and the other intercessors that were praying with you felt there was something to do with children in regard to this couple. So you asked if you could pray for them. Do you remember that?
A little bit. I think they were trying to have children. Is that right?
Yes, they couldn't have children. That's right. Yeah. And they were actually, turns out they were from another faith. We assumed that they were Christians. They weren't. But again, God reading their mail caused them to then be open. They came to Christ. They subsequently had children and so on. So yeah, it's just wonderful. And it's so easy to go to the practical. You know, you've got a problem with sales, you run a marketing campaign, and you've got a problem with something else. And yet God would challenge us to actually come to him for little things. I remember once we were doing a training, and I had put the projector, we had the projector sitting on top of a bar stool, but I walked past it, kicked the cord, the thing fell on the ground, and I went to my office, and you came to me and you said, what are you doing? I said, I'm ordering a new lamp for the projector. I mean, we turned it back on, it wasn't working. And you said, we haven't even prayed yet. And what happened? God
healed it.
He did, yes. It's very interesting. We saw again hard drives, computers, projectors, laptops, all sorts of things that God would intervene. I remember the time actually when Bernard from India was heading out. He was in the Middle East, day one of a 10-day tour, a business trip, and his laptop just packed up. And he's a tech guy, so he understands, and he knew this thing was dead. So yeah, it was a moment. So he closed it up, laid hands on it, prayed for it, opened it up, and it fired up, and he was able to continue with his business trip. But he was walking from one building to another through one of those air-conditioned tunnels in Dubai. And as he's walking along, he says to God, well, since you healed the laptop, how about my foot? Because he'd had problems with one of his feet for a couple of years, and God healed him. And so these aren't like big, get on your face and have an all-night prayer meeting kind of situations. Just the way that God intervenes in a way that is tangible for a business person. So that's
the lamp thing came from when the venture with Darlene, when I was matched with her. Yeah. I opened my laptop. It was after lunch. We came back, I opened my laptop. I had a plaid screen. I'd never seen. I'm like, this can't be good. And being from a healthcare background, I have no idea. I went, huh, and I just closed it really quickly. And Chooks saw me and he's like, what happened? I go, I have a plaid screen. He goes, give it to me. Yeah. So he took it behind the intercessor wall for about 20 minutes. And then he came back, he goes, it's working fine now. And he hands it to me. And I opened it up and it had its regular blue screen. And I'm like, okay. Yeah. So he completely fixed it. So after that, I had faith for all sorts of things.
That is amazing. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So one of the things that we saw often was this question of obstacles to people going where they wanted to go. And quite often it was an issue of, there was financial provision was one, but also physical conditions that would prevent people going through training or going on a venture. And so we learned that when people were training, we needed to be praying for them, whether it was on a phone call, a Zoom call, or a WebEx as we did back then, or in person. So now I did have a couple of problems with my intercessors because they're, instead of being the groaning sisterhood of miserable intercessors, you guys ended up being like the prayer party people, and and having a great time praying at the back, which was amazing.
Well, we were in your office at first, remember? And we were too noisy and distracting, so you had to move us to the back bedroom.
We moved to the back, and every now and then, when I was trying to teach people, I had to send a messenger over saying, "Hey, quieten down the prayer people, please." But people would send you the request sometimes, or otherwise you just ask God what was going on. And talk to me about some of your favorite memories about what happened in those times.
Well, I just remember putting on worship music, and it's before the trainees even get there. We'd start at like 8 a.m, and the trainees are arriving and having breakfast, and we just start praying, and then we blink and it's dinner time. We're like, what happened to the day? We prayed for 8-9 hours solid, and it was like a moment. And the presence of God was so thick and heavy. Most of us couldn't sit up. We were either leaning against the couch or on the floor, and we were interceding. And some of the trainees would come in, during breaks, and they would get hit by the presence and be flat out on the floor, and we'd have to help them back too. But I think some of my favorites was when I would have the trainees' names written on 3x5 cards, and I would just pass the cards around, and anything that the intercessors felt or heard or saw, or a verse or an impression, they would write on the cards, and then I would pass them out. Mm-hmm. And one lady, I can't even remember who it is now, it was something about a stuffed animal or a plush animal she had as a child, and she got it. She goes, who wrote this? Who wrote this? Yeah. And I'm like, I think that's Janet's handwriting. And so I took her over to Janet, and then she and Janet and the woman burst into tears and started telling Janet all this stuff. And Janet was able to pray for her. And this major thing in her heart from her childhood was healed right there. It was so amazing. It was so amazing.
So making it practical for business people coming out of some of those experiences. I remember once we were going to go work with a company in Texas. So what I did was I just handed you the org chart of the executive team. There were 17 people, as I recall. And you did a pretty good job because God gave you words for 16 out of the 17 people. Remember that?
Yeah, on the flight down there. I prayed on the flight
down there. And it was great because during the course of a consultation where we helped them work through their purpose and their business strategy and so forth, we also had a time actually asking them to remember the miraculous things God had done in the business. And it was just an amazing time because as they reflected back, because this is the issue with miracles, is that we forget. We forget. So scripture says, remember, remember, remember. And in their case, they were quite a very generous company, quite a, you might call, spiritual company. They had a world map and pegs on the wall as to missionaries they supported in different countries. But they changed that after our time with them, and they created, based on the stories we shared and their experience, a wall of remembrance, because we handed out 3x5 cards and we asked them to write down the miracles, and then they shared, and people cried. And I remember at the end, the president still had a stack of cards, and he would get halfway through reading something, tear up, and just pass it to me to finish reading it. And people remembered the stories, and it's a real faith builder. And a part of that was, what was encouraging to them was the words you gave those people on the org chart. So just simply praying over the org chart and say, God, what are you saying about these people that I've never met in your case? And what happened to number 17? Do you remember?
Well, we were given the preemptive org chart. They hadn't actually instituted it yet.
Right.
So number 17 wasn't there. And I just remember sitting on the plane like, God, what about this one? What about, and I got nothing. It was like radio silence. And I'm like, what about, God, I want to have something for everybody. What about this? Nothing. And I'm like, okay. So I just remember Xing it out because I didn't get anything. And they're like, oh, we haven't promoted him yet.
Yeah, that's good. So it's important not to kind of fake it. And I've been in some countries where you share something from scripture and they want you to share it as a prophecy. Well, it isn't. It's just something from scripture, which is fantastic and powerful and so on. So to not fake it, if God doesn't say anything for somebody, I was speaking to somebody in South Africa. I just met them, and they said to me, while you've been here 15 minutes, you should have a prophetic word for me. I said, I've got a prophetic question. And and so I loved just taking that into the practical. And you still do that today. I know recently Lynn had some women come and spend a day in a tent, and Chloe George brought them down from Nashville, came to our place in Chattanooga. And a powerful part of the day was that Lynn had given you the names, you knew nothing about them, and you'd ask God for something. And it's a really precious thing when somebody will take the time to pray for you and to ask God, what's going on with this person. And those women were seriously encouraged, and all of them have now joined a small group Bible study with their husbands since that event. Yeah.
Oh, that's really amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And so, Dena, we have had a couple more unusual things, and one always hesitates to share the unusual, but I'll share one that you don't expect me to share, but it was at the same season as we had another thing, right? So what happened was I noticed when we moved, I had this one person who worked with me, her name was Dena, and she would just go missing in action. And you were such a dedicated person. You showed up on time, you were methodical, you were diligent and everything. But twice when we moved, I noticed that you checked out a little bit. And so I spoke with you about it. I said, hey, Dee, I noticed this. Does it ring a bell with you? And you said, nope. And so I remember standing in our spare room and I said, okay, let's just pray. We held hands and we prayed. And in 10 seconds, God showed you something and just kind of gave you a revelation of something that had happened in the past. And he just flipped the switch on that. And it was never an issue again. It was just a practical thing. But at that same time, since moving was not your favorite thing, you had a car, Blanche, this big white car that you had. And I remember once we were about to move and you opened your trunk. What happened?
We were moving, yes, from Los Altos up to Saratoga, and my friend Loretta was there, and she was helping me put stuff into Blanche's trunk. And Blanche was a Bonneville, so she's got a very generous trunk. Right. And I hear through the windows, I hear Loretta screaming, and I'm like screaming in happiness, like jumping up and down, screaming, happy, happy. And I'm like, so I race down the stairs, and there are 3 towers of gold dust in the trunk. Like somebody had taken a picture, like poured out glitter tubes, 3, they look like little trees. in the trunk, and we tried to pick it up and we couldn't pick it up. We couldn't hold it. It just went all over. And pretty soon it's coating the whole trunk. And we were trying to get samples of it and put it in bags, and we couldn't. But yeah, the gold dust all over the trunk. It was so amazing.
Yeah. And
Anointed
that wasn't
bottle.
the first, it wasn't the first time we'd heard about people. In fact, Lynn and I had been at a conference in 2010 in Texas, met this guy who was an artist, and he told us that in his house, that it was quite normal in his house for guests and people in his house, his family, his daughter, and so on, to just get this glittery gold dust. And Lynn and I were just chatting with him, and quite a funky, artsy guy. He's quite a well-known exhibitor. So he just prayed for us. And so there was some gold dust on her hands. And then the next day, on a pair of black slacks that Lynn was wearing, I remember that. Then the next day she changed into a different pair, same story. And that, I mean, there's no great rhyme or reason, but I have remembered that in times of trouble, we had a client up in Washington State, and they were going through quite a challenging time. And they'd just been through the big weekend. They had a foreign student staying with them from overseas, from Southeast Asia or from Asia. And she said, wouldn't it be great if God did the miracles up here that he did down in California at the big weekend? And they were talking about, she was sitting there, maybe it could snow inside the house, or maybe this, or maybe that. And they were just talking about that. And then as the adults were talking, making a noise, they woke the kids, and the kids came through, and the kids were covered in gold dust from the tips of their fingers down to their elbows. And then the adults looked at their hands, and they also had the same experience, also couldn't wipe it out. And I remember the guy going to his board meeting the next day, his management team meeting, with the gold dust on his hands, the kids going to school, and the teachers asking, what is it? And they said, well, it's the glory of God. And quite a fascinating thing. And so often when there was a hard time, it would just be something that was apparent, something to encourage people. It wasn't the last time, however. I remember once, you remember that story up at Saratoga? What happened there? We had a visitor. Remember, Songhwa was visiting us from Korea.
Yeah, we were, Lynn had done a huge shop.
Yeah.
And I think we were feeding like 60 people the next day or something. And so we were putting groceries away, and I was playing Tetris with all of the cups, plates, spoons, trying to get them in the bins.
Yeah.
And so I had pulled everything out and was repacking it. And then I shifted, and I'm like, I'm coated in gold dust. The floor's coated in gold dust. And I'm happily in there. It's not really my job, but it was, sorry about that. It's trying to authenticate my software right now.
We can see you fine. Yeah.
But everything was coated in gold, and I start shaking my hands like this, and I'm jumping up and down, and Jessica Monroe, our intern at the time, comes out, and I see it coming out of my fingers as I'm shaking. It's coming out of me, and it's falling everywhere. And Jessica and I are in this little pantry with the bin, jumping up and down, and gold dust is going everywhere. And Sung is like, what's going on? You spilled glitter? So much fun. So much fun. It was everywhere, and we couldn't pick it up. It was
yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, so it's an unusual thing. And I think the principle is that God, in any way he wants to reveal his glory in a situation, wants to show up in a situation and say, look, I'm God and I can do whatever I want. And we've certainly seen not always everything to the positive. I remember we had a client in South Africa in 2006, and they had quite a story with an obstinate crane that they had in the business, the guys out at CSI. And this crane was key to their manufacturing process as they manufactured certain items. And they were hesitant about coming on this 10-day consultation. It's a big chunk of time out of their schedule. And their crane broke, and they couldn't get the parts. And the crane broke for the period of the venture. And then it worked again. And when we went back a few years later, their crane broke again. So they should be billing us for a loss of productivity. But of course, God did lots of other things in that time, which is just amazing. Yeah. So, Dee, in terms of some of these things that you remember over the years, what's some of the takeaways for you in terms of what you've seen the miraculous do in the lives of businessmen and women?
God will do everything he can to reach people, and he
Yeah.
will use anything.
Yeah.
He'll use anything. It's if healing will affect your heart, he'll do it.
Mm.
If you need to see gold dust to understand him better, he'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
He loves us so much, and he wants to reach us so much that the miraculous isn't hard for him.
Yeah. Yeah. What we've often seen with the business people is that it's, as I said earlier, it's a miracle in the context of the business. So when Jodine and I went to work with a company in another state, and we had a management team, and what happened was, I would say, I think there were about 13 or 17 people in the team, a good sized team, and about half of them were people of faith. Or followers of Jesus, and half of them weren't. I mean, they were Pacific Northwest tree huggers, and various other things, or just, they didn't have that. And it was a bit awkward because I remember on our second day, one of the avid Christians, early in the meeting says, "We've got a lot of things going on in the company. Can you pray for us?" Now, we weren't there on a religious ticket, as it were. And, but the client asked, and I can see some of the people in the room looking a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
What's going on, including some of the Christians. And so I felt prompted to say, look, if you will write down on the whiteboard the areas where you need a miracle or answers to prayer, then we will pray. And so they got up and started writing one by one. Different people wrote different things, including the skeptics, of course, because they had a point to prove. And so they wrote it up, and Jodine prayed very simply for them. And one of the items on the list was a guy by the name of Michael Grant. He was in charge of the injection molding, which is a plastic molding machine to make components for that they would make you infuse plastic into these molds. But the thing had never worked. They had a $600,000 machine that they'd purchased from Germany. It had never worked. They'd had the manufacturers over, the engineers over. Nothing worked. And Michael had even wondered, man, if I could get enough of a firewall around this thing and burn it, I could get the insurance money and we could start again. And he was a pretty fresh off the boat, new follower of Jesus. So he had a couple of thoughts like that. And so that was on the list, this expensive machine. Anyway, the next morning, we went through the day. The next morning, people came in. The list was still up on the wall. Two things happened. The guy who was the chief operating officer thought to himself, this is going to be embarrassing, because it's fine when we're talking about the principles of purpose for a business and so forth. But now there's this prayer thing, and there's going to be no answers, and it's going to be embarrassing. Even though he was a Christian guy, that's what he thought. He told us later. But the next morning, I asked, how are we doing on the list? And there the list was up on the wall. And this guy, Michael Grant, got up and he said, the strangest thing, I went back to my desk last night. It was kind of late in the day. And my phone rang at my desk, my direct line rang. And this guy said to me, do you have a such and such machine? I said, yes. He said, does it work? I said, no, it's never worked a day in his life. He said, well, there's a problem with the software. Now, he didn't know where this guy was from, where he was calling from, how the guy knew that he had one of these machines. So he said, like, fire up the machine and then open up the code, and you need to type in these 3 lines of code. Now, Michael just typed exactly what the guy told him to type, hit the button, and the machine worked. And that began a whole series of miracles. Now, it wasn't, a kid getting healed or eyes getting healed or even gold dust. In that case, that was the miracle that Michael needed. And then it started the domino of things in that situation. Now, we can't explain it. We can't explain. And so actually, Dena, I'd like to wrap up with one more thing, because when I was thinking about you speaking, it seems to me, Oz Hillman used to say, God begins to speak when the plane door closes. In other words, don't spend all your time praying about whether you should go to Africa or India or Indonesia or China, wherever. Just go, and then God will show up when the plane door closes. You'll get what you need when you obey. And I remember we'd been out on a trip, and you went afterwards on a well-deserved vacation, and you went to Thailand. What happened in Thailand?
Oh, I think this was 2009, and it made international news headlines. I flew from Indonesia, Jakarta, to Thailand, and I was meeting one of my coworkers, and we were going to meet in Bangkok. And I got there, and it was really strange because there was hardly anyone on the plane, and I was excited because my bag showed up. And so I got my bag off the carousel, and I was told to go get a taxi in the front lobby and then give them the name of the hotel, and I would go. Well, I go to the taxi line, and it's not moving. It's the full length of the departure area, and it's not moving. I stood in it for 45 minutes. It didn't move. And I'm like, Lord, what's going on? And to top this off, I don't feel well. I've got a fever. I've got a really bad racking cough. I found out later I had bronchitis, but I don't feel well. And so I'm like, Lord, what is going on? Why isn't this moving? And what do I do? Well, this little man came up to me dressed in like hotel porter garb. And I was like, okay. And he grabs my bag. I had my briefcase, and he grabs my roller bag, and he goes, come. And he just marches off with my bag. And I'm like, okay. So I just follow him. And there was a businessman in front of me and a Muslim lady behind me, and they also followed. We went down through this thing and out through this thing. I have no idea where the man took me. And I end up.
You literally went down a luggage chute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had me crawling under things, and I just followed him because he had my bag. And so we end up in the arrivals hallway, and it was like a ghost town. There was no one there. None of the counters were manned. It was like 4 PM. I'm like, this is so strange. Yeah. And I'm racing after this little guy, and he goes, taxi, hands me my bag, and walks off. And I turned around to thank him or tip him. He was gone, like poof, gone, like non-existent, gone. I should have been able to find him because it was me, the Muslim lady, and the business guy. That's it.
Yeah.
But I swear he was an angel. So I went out. Long story short, I got in a taxi. I went to the hotel. And the next morning I wake up, and on every TV is the yellow shirt takeover.
Yeah.
About 20 minutes after I left the airport, the yellow shirts took over the airport for the next 10 days. Right. Everybody was locked in. They were held hostage in the airport. And it was a political coup of some sort. Yeah. And so God got me out in time. I met my girlfriend. Tons of stories. It's like how I got on the bus and everything else to Phuket, and how I found it was all God. It was amazing. So many angels helping me.
Yeah. Fascinating. Absolutely. Yeah, fascinating. And it's not the first angel while traveling story, and not the only angel story you had in your time with us, for sure. You've probably had others. And it's an interesting thing. And I do remember, and we can close with this, when we moved into the new house in Saratoga, we were invited to have people over for a prayer night to pray over the new house, which is a good idea to do when you move into a new place. Pray for God's presence, God's blessing. And but our son Davey arrived back from college. He was down at college, and he wanted to hang out with mom and dad. And like a good student, he wanted to go and eat. So we abandoned you guys and took Davey out for a meal. And then you split the men and the women. And then what happened?
It was a nice house because it had a surround sound system. So we put on worship music super loud. Yeah. And the guys took the front half of the room, and the girls took the back half of the room. And first of all, we walked around the entire property and anointed it on the whole outside of it. And then we went inside and we anointed every window, door. And we called the presence of God in to the house, and we dedicated it to him. Yeah. And I was assigned the landing outside of your and Lynn's suite of rooms that you had upstairs. And I remember being up there and praying, and I saw these two huge guardian angels standing outside your door. One was darker skinned, one was fair. And I remember looking at them and I'm like, why are you here? And they're like, we protect this room. We only let in the people that should be in here. Nothing goes past us that shouldn't be in here. And I was like, okay. But they were huge men standing outside your bedroom door.
Didn't it freak you out to have a conversation with an angel a bit?
No, I was too drunk in the spirit to really understand. Now I'm like, oh my gosh. But then I was just like, okay. It was like this childlikeness.
Yeah.
I wasn't freaked out by them. I was just like,
so you asked them a
whoa.
question, they gave you an answer.
Mm-hmm. And they were very matter of fact. This is what we're here for. We're no nonsense.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
It was just, we protect the sanctity of these rooms, is what they told me. I'm like,
yeah.
okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, that's wonderful. We need to really up our expectation of seeing God, seeing what God is doing, seeing where angels are visible and not visible, but simply not just taking it like me when I go for the get on Amazon and order the replacement versus hold on, let's at least give God a chance, at least.
And those bulbs are expensive.
They are expensive, but often, you know, I know with Lynn as well, with people, when people will say, I've got a headache, do you have an aspirin? Do you have an Advil? Do you have a Tylenol? And she's like, okay, could I pray for you first? And if you're not better after 20 minutes, I'll give you the Tylenol, which is fair. But often, again and again and again, God actually does the healing on something small like that. And certainly we've seen it happen with big matters as well. Yeah. Dena, thank you for taking the time to share some of these stories. It's been fun to reminisce and think about these things. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I just want to encourage people, you know, over the years as I worked with Dena, I had the privilege of her being my personal assistant, head of intercession, and she also, whether she liked it or not, actually took care of our books as well, which was fantastic, in our finances, where we saw a few miracles as well, and well, a lot of them. And so it was a privilege, and I would just encourage people who are listening to this to have people who are praying, not just vaguely for the business, but about the specifics of the business and involved in the strategy of the business and in the problems and in the challenges and the opportunities of the business. In other words, if you're a kingdom business, you have to have prayer as a corporate competence, just as you would have marketing, sales, finance. Prayer, intercession needs to be a corporate competence, because that's what provides the spiritual capital for a kingdom business. So, Dena, thank you for doing that for so many companies, including our own. We greatly appreciate you.